Hello again, everybody. Ooh. I didn't expect to be quite so loud. You might actually hear what I'm thinking, other than what I'm just saying. Welcome to everybody, great crowd tonight, and also welcome to everybody who's watching this streaming so that they can go seamlessly into the debate without having to get up. If you're wondering, does Fauré have anything to do with the debate? Actually, it's always possible to make a connection, but very quickly I will make a very strong connection for you. It's political. In France, in Fauré's lifetime, there was a huge political struggle in music. And the political struggle was so enormous that it was part of the government, part of education in general, and it reached all the composers and musicians. In a nutshell, because I don't want to go on about this, but I will briefly. You had the Schola Cantorum, which was a music school founded by Vincent d'Indy. I have to say it that way because he was French. Vincent d'Indy. And on the other side, you had the Conservatoire, which was much older. It's not just that these two schools had extremely different approaches to teaching. It's not like you have Juilliard and Mannes or something. It's not like that, which has all the same faculty. Anyway, basically the difference was profound because the Schola Cantorum was founded as a Catholic religious classical music school with the idea that after the Dreyfus affair, it was important that Catholicism be understood in France to be the root of classical music in France, and it was anti-Semitic, the school, and it would not allow any discussion of anything that did not proceed from Gregorian chant through slowly into modern times in the way that they saw fit to do so. d'Indy himself was a very outspoken politically, and everyone who taught there had to somehow or other agree to this agenda. The Conservatoire was more modern, it was freewheeling, it had very little of, the curriculum was always changing, just like schools are now. And the war between these, and I call it a war because d'Indy himself declared it a war. He said if they want war, they've got it. Of course it was in French. And I'm not going to go there, but it sounds worse, actually. But basically what happened was they needed at the Conservatoire to find someone who could lead the conservatory and bring all these musicians together, and it was Fauré. And how did he do it? He did not go to the Schola Cantorum as a student, and he did not go to the Conservatoire. He was an outsider. Things never change. But not only was he an outsider, he was politically actually quite liberal, and he was a supporter of Dreyfus and all of this. However, the school that he went to, and I will get into that more because it really relates to the music you're going to hear, the school that he went to, which was called the Niedermeyer School, was in fact based in Gregorian chant and modal writing, and they were all trained to be church musicians, but they had a kind of strange forward-looking concept as well. So he had both things in his life, and by time he was just about 60 when he got the job as head of the conservatoire. And he did bring everyone together, quite remarkably. So he does relate to tonight's debate in whatever way you want to pursue that. Interestingly about Fauré, I told him they'd play right away, but anyway, very soon. I'll wait till you're completely cold and forgot what piece it is. Basically, Fauré grew up in a world where Chopin was composing when Fauré was young, and Schumann was a modern composer, and Wagner was all the rage, except for Fauré, who didn't think so, but everybody else did. And by time Fauré died, he had lived through The Rite of Spring, Berg operas, Shostakovich. That's really something. It's partly just when he happened to live. And 1845 to 1924. So he saw quite a lot of musical change. And today, you could think of it in terms of technology, how much has changed from what we used to do to what we do. But artistically, that was an unbelievable period that is very rare for a period of 79 years to encompass such a revolution in music and the arts in general. So before I say anything else, you need to hear some of this piece, and they need to play. Did you tune by any chance, or are you all set to go? Okay, even for French music, it's very important. Well, that was the Bush administration when everything was anti-French. It's not true now. Okay. So I'm going to ask them to play from the very beginning up until what we call this letter B, which is where the second theme really gets going. We'll stop there for now. Very passionate music. Different kind of romanticism from the German romanticism. And we're going to look at what that means, maybe right now. Let's start immediately. If you think of Brahms and Fauré, which people do a lot, partly because Aaron Copland was the one who said that Fauré was the French Brahms. And I guess if somebody has to be the French Brahms, it would be Fauré. But they're very, very different. And from an emotional standpoint, their lives and their musical training actually reflect each other quite well. In other words, Brahms, as you probably know, never got married. He had a slogan, which was frei aber einsam, free but lonely. And he felt that he could never live with someone at all because they would be critical of his music, or he wouldn't be able to live up to his own standards and he'd be miserable to live with. He had all kinds of excuses. And his music, from a romantic point of view, and in terms of the romantic emotional point of view, which is embodied in the way the music exists, the music is full of yearning, very often unresolved, or it is often nostalgic, looking for something that seems like maybe it never happened. And that's quite true, that he was full of yearning for Clara Schumann and other people and for a different life than he had, and it was mostly a life of unconsummated desire. Fauré was the complete opposite. Don't forget, he was also French. Fauré, like Debussy, if you want to understand the personal life of these people, you usually have to write it down and take copious notes. Fauré fell madly in love with the daughter of Pauline Viardot. If you don't know who Pauline Viardot is, don't make any expressions I don't necessarily need to know, if you know. But Pauline Viardot was one of the great lights of the musical world in the 19th century. She was a great singer and a composer and a pianist. And she was friends with Liszt and Schumann and Italian composers. Her sister was the soprano Malibran. Her father was a famous singer, and Pauline Viardot and her sister and her father played leading roles in many of the premieres of operas at the time, and they came over to New York and did the first performance. All three of them were in the first performance of Don Giovanni. Anyway, so Saint-Saëns knew Pauline Viardot. Everybody knew her in the music world, and her daughter Marianne was a good age to marry Fauré. So Fauré proposed to her, she accepted, and then a few months later she said, forget it. Apparently she didn't really feel for him what she wanted to, but whatever the reasons are, he was very, very devastated. And it's important to know that up until this time, he was thought of as charming, funny, well-balanced, light, etc. Starting at this moment of rejection, he had 10 years where his personality went in and out of what it was before, but tormented and interrupted by huge battles with depression and other things. Meanwhile, he got married in that period to, well, why not? To, it's France, to Marie Fremier, who was the daughter of Emmanuel Fremier, who was a famous sculptor at the time. They had 2 children, but Fauré was never really happy, apparently. He had many, many, many girlfriends. This is a quote from someone who knew him, who wrote about him. His conquests were legion in the Paris salons. After a romantic attachment to the singer Emma Bardac, hold on to that name, from around 1892, he was married in 1890, followed by another to the composer Adela Madison. He met the pianist Marguerite Hasselmans, and this led to a relationship that lasted the rest of his life, although there were other girlfriends as well. Emma Bardac, who had a very important affair. Well, let's put it this way. It was important to them, and it's historically recorded, because she dumped Fauré and left her husband, who was someone else, and married Debussy. Okay, this is very important to know because, I mean, there's even a movie, by the way, a short movie, which is not made by Hollywood or anything like it. It's made by the duo piano team, Katja and Mirella Lebec, the Lebec sisters, Mariella Lebec, and they play pieces by Fauré and Debussy and a few other French people. And there's a script, and they act out parts, and it's okay. But in it, just so you know, in it, the rumor is perpetuated on film that Fauré's liaison with Emma Bardac produced a child, and the child, Hélène, was nicknamed Dolly, and the famous Dolly Suite by Fauré was written for his daughter by Emma Bardac, but it's not true. I just want to set the record straight. Yes, he wrote it for her, but she doesn't, there's no reason, there's no evidence, and seems to be quite true that it was just her daughter, not his. Okay, I'm so glad I cleared that up. Now, let's take a listen again to just the theme played by the strings for a moment, without the piano, and then we'll hear the piano without the strings. Let's just hear the opening theme, and I want you to think of it rhythmically. If you were to tap your foot, and where do you think this theme starts in terms of pulse and meter? Go ahead. Very passionate theme. This is typical of Fauré, very, very long lines. One of the interesting things about it is that you might, excuse me, this is the beginning of this problem. You might think when you hear this theme, that's the opening, that it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. 1, 2, 3, 4, or 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. But actually, it goes like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, okay? Yeah, so if you know the piece, you know that. But it's all off on purpose. I mean, the music is rhythmically distraught. And so Fauré places the heavy beat on the upbeat. And this causes already a kind of emotional turmoil that I guess he communicated brilliantly. The musicians, in practicing it, have the problem of reading the music as notated. So if you first time you hear the piece, you're reading it, you may not realize how strange it is. But I was asking them about it. I didn't ask you. What did you think when you first heard this piece? Did you find the beat to be in the right place?
No, I didn't.
You didn't?
No.
Did it bother you?
Yes.
Yes? But the thing is, Fauré does have a sense of responsibility to set it up. So you have 3 beats of piano before they come in. Let's hear those 3 beats. Okay, that helps, right? That makes you feel really secure. Now, if you hit the downbeats really hard, which is bad playing, what would that sound like? Right, then you would feel it. But in order to make sure you don't do that, he writes piano and crescendo. So you have to do what you did. Do that again. It starts from nowhere. Okay, Okay, you see, so it actually comes out of nowhere, and you can't feel that pulse. Then the theme comes in. Now, I'm going to have to go to the piano again, and probably for a considerable length of time. So park yourself over there. Yeah, but you'll be back in just a moment. Ooh, you sit very low, very, very low. Wow. No, it's okay. I can handle it. Wow, I feel like I'm 7 years old. My first piano lesson. Okay, the harmonies. I'm getting a little feedback, not from you. It's that mic over there. Okay, the harmonies that. All right, it's probably the ghost of Fauré. The harmonies that Fauré writes are incredibly complex, and I'm going to discuss them in detail, but first let's take a look at what he didn't write. I'll simplify it. Here's the tune. Let's not worry about the rhythm. Just that much, because that's the opening phrase. If the harmonies would be the implied harmonies, the logical harmonies that go with this modal melody, meaning it's kind of G minor, but it's actually kind of modal, like Dorian, and I'll explain that, or I'll explain that in just a moment. It's actually natural minor, what is sometimes called Aeolian. This is the most obvious thing to do. He doesn't do any of those things. I mean, he does the first chord, but then we have with the seventh, and then we have this note becomes a dissonance. And again, we have a chord, but there's a D that never goes away. That is expected. Now listen to this. Okay, you got it. Okay, now it is extremely dissonant, and one of the ways he deals with it is by having the harmonic language only in the piano at this point, and the strings have the melody. So the separation works very well. Now, harmonically, you have an omnipresent D, which is kind of what we would call a pedal point. Now, a pedal point, many of you know this, pedal point comes from the expression on the organ where you put your foot on the organ pedal and you leave it there. On the piano, you can use the middle pedal sometimes. I mean, yeah, let's go. There. And the D stays there. That happens a lot on organs. I think sometimes because when the pedals were first invented, nobody could play them. So they just left their foot there. But and then they would move it slowly, and it became a style of composition. Anyway, don't quote me on that. Okay. However, that stays there for a very, very long time. In fact, the entire melody that you heard, it's always there. Now, what does a pedal point mean? Why is it there? See, I like to ask what things mean, and which is, if you don't like stuff like that, don't go to lectures, because we do that all the time at lectures. What does it mean to have that D there? If Brahms wrote it, it would be two things: a reference to church music, Baroque music, where pedal points are very common, and they last. And it's something that you head towards. It's something perhaps that you work against. And some of you may remember that I once talked about the relationship Brahms had with Clara Schumann. They both loved pedal points. There's some letters about that. So he might have written some of them for her. And in fact, it might have been that she was kind of a pedal point in his life. With Fauré, well, why not? With Fauré, you have these harmonies that are searching and very dissonant. Let me show you a few more of them. Here, with the D, with the D, wow. Now, if this chord gets to you, that's great. That means your ear is in tune with tonality, because it's very far away to go to B minor from G minor. And you expect, but you get, that's really bizarre, but not to Fauré. And I'll explain why in a moment. And then, finally, we do get a cadence. Finally. And the D, if the harmonies are searching and they're dissonant and they're trying to break free from tonality, they feel like they're trying to get away from G minor, and they don't quite. Perhaps the D is that marriage. You don't have to agree with that. But that's the kind of thing that is provocative. Because, see, I, as a composer, do think that what happens in your life informs the choices you make when you compose, even though it's abstract. And you may or may not be able to identify them. Fauré is not here to defend himself, and who knows what he would say. But the harmonic world of this movement, and of a lot of his pieces, as more and more as he goes on, is very dramatic, it's very intense, and it's quite dissonant, and it gets more and more dissonant. He also was getting deaf, which happened later, and so he felt like Beethoven did freer, not less free, freer, because he lived in his internal world, and he had more and more to write about, more drama, more trouble, more anxiety, and so he was freer to express it without having to concern himself. So perhaps he feels locked in the pedal point to a marriage, and he's struggling to get out of it. Now these harmonies, that's the romantic analysis. In order for you to understand the harmonic analysis, I'm going to ask this question. Luckily, I've answered it. The question is, what would Brahms write with this tune? What would the music sound like? So here's the tune. And I do a little bit of Brahmsian writing. That last phrase. So if Brahms were to write this, he would be sticking closer to functioning harmony. Harmonies where the chords, whether they're dissonant or not, the chords have their traditional functions. He would write dissonant harmonies, but not at the opening of a piece like that, and not as dissonant as those, and as full of clashes as that. So here, that's a fairly dissonant chord, but it moves conventionally. And he would establish right away the dominant of the key, the polarities of the key. And then it would go on, okay? Now, what about Debussy? The reason I ask that is that Fauré is often seen correctly as a kind of bridge between a world of Brahms and those people, Brahms and Schumann, and Debussy. It's important to realize that Debussy was born after Fauré and died before Fauré died. He lived a much shorter life. And in a way, it reminds me of Haydn and Mozart. Because, you know, Haydn lived a long time, and Mozart lived in the middle of that very briefly. And Haydn was influenced by Mozart. First, Mozart was influenced by Haydn, and then when Mozart was alive, Haydn was influenced by Mozart, and then he died, and Haydn continued to explore that. And also Haydn was influenced by Beethoven. So in a way, Fauré is kind of a Haydn, Mozart, start that again. Fauré is like Haydn, and Debussy is kind of somewhere between Mozart and Beethoven together. So the harmonies of Debussy maybe would be something like this with the same tune. And Fauré sounds a little bit like that and a little bit like Brahms, because he really bridged that gap. Here are the chords as Fauré wrote them in block chords. I wrote this out to make it simple for me without having to turn all the pages and things, even though I didn't know you would be here to do that. But this is Fauré's harmonies. Some of the dissonances are the D pedal tones. Now, let's hear what he does with the same theme in a few other places. And then I'm going to talk to you about where did he get these crazy ideas? Did he just come to him out of nowhere? No. Of course, if they had, I would have to say yes, but I don't think so. So let's hear the theme again, but harmonized very, very differently. Let's say, let's start at C, where the theme is a little different, but it's just a little bit of what he does with it harmonically. There's some changes here. Okay, now you see there, this is very important, from a compositional point of view, a tune grows out of harmony, even if the harmony seems dissonant to it. So here he had different harmonic ideas, so the tune has the same shape, but it's different. But there is a spot where it's extremely similar, near the end, but the harmonies are stunningly different. Let's take a look at that. That's, maybe we were going to start at 204, leading into, that's the last, leading into the coda. That actually is a very strange harmonic world. In fact, the last cadence, the chords, sorry, the last cadence is this. It's an A major chord to a G major chord. It's a parallel harmony like Debussy might do. Which is why he lets this G major chord at the end sit for a long time, so you then eventually say, oh yes, this is it, it's over. But there's a moment when you don't think that's true, which is quite great because it doesn't sound like what you would expect. Instead of going, you know, there's an ending that you would expect. That's the old-fashioned. But this is the kind of thing that Debussy would pick up on. Now, what's at stake here, what's the basic concept underlying this, is that Fauré's musical training as a child was actually extremely different from everybody else in Europe except for the people who went to this tiny little school with him. And this Niedermeyer school had a direct line to some Baroque teachers of harmony. And there's one along the way who was a classical composer, contemporary of Mozart's. Somebody Mozart despised, so it was a horrible composer and a terrible musician. And he taught someone who taught Saint-Saëns. And Saint-Saëns came to the little Niedermeyer school and got a job there, and when Niedermeyer died, he took over the classes and was the teacher of Fauré. And of course, Saint-Saëns was a very conventional and traditional composer, generally speaking, but his education came from one man who had been in this line of harmonic teaching that was different. Now, I'll show you what's different about it, pardon me. Believe it or not, well, you believe this easily, the internet is full of things you would never expect. There was a treatise written by Gustave Lefebvre, who was the son-in-law of Niedermeyer. This little treatise summed up the harmonic practices that Fauré learned, and they're quite strange. And you can find them online. The original book, which I copied some of, is from the École de musique classique, fondée par Niedermeyer, traité d'harmonie, Gustave Lefebvre, directeur. This was published. This is exactly what it was. And this is a summary of what Fauré was taught. Now, first, let me back up. What was everybody else taught? Well, most people were taught at that time that harmony had function. Here's a major scale with chords. And that if you sharp or flat something, you give it an accidental, it has a new purpose. That will lead here, or here. It has a function. You don't just do this and come back. I mean, you could do that if you want, but the idea is that each note has a purpose. So in Mozart's language, whatever it may be, that C sharp leads here, or that G sharp leads there. You don't just throw notes in for no reason. And the logic that emerges from this sense of purpose of every note, this function, this logic that emerges, is the logic of tonal music. It doesn't just exist, it was invented in the Baroque period. I mean, it took a long time, but it was invented by composers through their music, and it makes perfect sense. And in the 19th century, there was a departure from a lot of this gradually. Debussy's the most obvious example, and then Scriabin, and then, of course, in the German world, Schoenberg, and then it changes completely. But there was a subculture that goes back to the Baroque period and became very important in the classical period, and in France existed in the Niedermeyer school. That subculture said that this note is fine just like that. And maybe you can do this and then come back. In other words, alterations are not modulations. Changing a note is a color. It is just, as they actually say in the book, a fugitive moment. It's an impression which can go away. It accepts dissonances that became part of Debussy's language. But Debussy didn't study this way. He went to the Conservatoire. But don't forget, he encountered Fauré. So there was a lot of, in fact, Debussy even said that he owed Fauré a great, great deal. So, for example, here is an acceptable harmony in this book. This is from 1889. Here are some acceptable chords. Now, some of them are perfectly acceptable even to Beethoven, like this. But in Beethoven, this is in this key. In this book, this chord, or this chord, or this chord, or this chord, they're all in C major if you want, because they're just colors. It's very different. It says right here, la faculté de déterminer une impression fugitive de modulation. It says an unprepared dissonance, that means one that just appears without being set up carefully. An unprepared dissonance is a fleeting, transient impression, not a modulation. So, for example, an exercise that a student would have had at that time included going up the chromatic scale, which is this, every note on the keyboard, and down, and figuring out harmonies, but thinking of it all as not changing key. So you would, let's say, this is all C major. So you would be crawling your way up the keyboard, thinking of that as colors. Now, who wrote like that a little bit? Chopin, and a little bit Schumann. Because there was this gestalt. I mean, people knew these harmonies were a natural result of the feelings that people had of wanting to expand tonality, of wanting to have chromaticism infiltrate and basically change, modify what we meant by harmony. But here, it was a system. Fauré entered this school at age 9, and he left at age 20. When he left, he got a degree certifying that he could be an organist at a church. A little overqualified. He was, in fact, the organist at many famous churches in France, mostly in Paris. He also was an official. He got a job where he was, this is only in France do you find this kind of job, inspector of the local conservatories. I love that. He was also inspector of various ensembles. By inspector of local conservatories, they still have these kinds of jobs. It's very centralized. inspector of the local conservatories, I shouldn't say local, provincial, inspector of provincial conservatories. He would go all over France to each music school to make sure that they were teaching well. It's a job he despised, but it was good to travel, and like everything else he did, until he was, I guess in his early 50s, he didn't make much money from music. He was mostly making money teaching, performing in ways that were not interesting to him, like playing at church services. That was not somebody of Fauré's stature. That wasn't good enough. He was fired from his first church job because right from the very beginning as a young man, he didn't behave very well. There's a famous story of his showing up on a Sunday morning to play, and he was dressed the same way he had been the night before because he had actually never gone home. He had gone out on the town and then just showed up at the church, and he had been eating and drinking, and so he got fired. I just love that story because it humanizes him a little bit. All right, now more things in this book that are quite remarkable. Here is a set of chords in C major. This is right from the book. I'm not improvising. It has nothing to do with C major, except it considers all alterations to relate to the key. So when Fauré does these strange harmonies, when he does this chord instead of this chord, he goes, and then he gets back to the tonality, but first he departs, but it's not a weird departure for him. It's very dramatic the way he thinks of it in this moment, because it is expressing his feelings, it is, or I should say it's expressing his concept for the piece, not his feelings at the moment that he writes the chord. You know, it doesn't work quite like that. But he's expressing the mood, the drama, everything else, but at the same time, the vocabulary comes from this strange training. So in fact, he's a unique example of someone who had unusual and almost unique training, because hardly anyone else from that school, in fact, maybe nobody else from that school, became a well-known musician. They just were church musicians. The only other person, I guess, was Saint-Saëns, but he didn't study there. He only taught there. And Saint-Saëns helped Fauré his whole life because he taught at the school. There was no one else but Fauré of great talent. So he went their whole lives. They were friends, and Saint-Saëns opened as many doors as he could for him, including getting involved with his getting the presidency of the Conservatoire. But of course, later on in life, Fauré was a beloved figure in France, and Saint-Saëns was not, because Saint-Saëns was very, very political and was so involved in machinations behind the scenes that people really got sick of him. Unfortunately, he was called Saint-Saëns and Delilah because of his opera. It's strange but true. Now, back to the music here. Let's hear another passage and then take a look at some of these harmonies. Let's see what would be a Let's go again from C, but this time we will go all the way through to the downbeat of 70, which if you keep going, I'll just say stop. Okay, good. Oh, it's really good stuff. By the way, did you notice that the tune in the violin did not have that strange pickup this time? If you didn't, can we start right where it goes to E major, that's bar 65, right where it says pianissimo sempre, and we have 2 G sharps in the strings, and the violin comes on the next measure? Okay, now play it again, but could you put the E before that's not written there, just so we know what I'm talking about? No, but do it as a full quarter, like it is at the beginning. One more time. Right, now he leaves that pickup out because he knew, of course he knew, that pickup is disturbing. And here things are sweet and beautiful and dreamy, so he leaves it out. And you realize that the tune actually does start on 1 when it's a happy, sweet little tune. But when it's a tormented tune in minor and it's locked in a loveless marriage and has 2 kids at home and he's having an affair with the woman who is going to marry Debussy, it needs an upbeat. You think I'm reading into it? Well, you have a choice in music. Either you read into it or you don't read anything into it. Well, maybe there might be another choice too. Okay. Now, I'm going to displace you for a moment, just like that beat was displaced, and take a look at some of the harmonies. Well, one of the most important things that you've just been hearing a lot of is an augmented triad and what it can do. Now, some of you know a lot about music, and some of you don't know much less. But in other words, the concept of augmented triad is not very complicated. Here's a major chord. If you take the top note and move it up a half step, that's an augmented triad. Now, an augmented triad could just go back to where it came from, like this. But it also has many interesting properties, because if you raise any of these notes a half step, one in the middle, if you raise any one of those notes a half step, you get a new minor chord. If you lower any one of those notes, you get a new major chord. See, this is a good one. Does it remind you of another chord in a strange way? Those of you who've been taking this class for 20 years? And there are about 8 of you? It is almost like what the diminished 7th chord does. The diminished 7th chord is completely symmetrical. So it can resolve 8 different ways. This is also symmetrical. By symmetrical, this is a simple concept. There are 2 intervals. They are the same interval, major third. So it's symmetrical, as opposed to this chord. This is a major third and a minor third, so it's not symmetrical. So this, when a chord is symmetrical, it has many equal potential resolutions because it's symmetrical. So it could go here, could go there, could go here. It's poised, as opposed to a chord that's like this, which is going to go over here. And if it goes over here, it's a deceptive cadence. A chord like this can go here. It's like a good tennis player. So Fauré is going to go sometimes, and sometimes he's going to go. And these are the things that you've just been listening to. He also might take this chord, and like he might. He just did it. So it's not that he might take the chord. Here you have what sounds like a C minor chord because it is one. And then instead of going, in many places he could have gone, he goes this. And we don't know really where he could go. He has a lot of options here. This is Beethoven-like in that there's a note here and with no chord hanging there because he wants you to think what's going to happen now. So he adds an augmented chord around it. We still don't know what's going to happen because it's an augmented chord. And it goes, that's a good one. It could have gone, which also would have been nice. It also could have gone to a minor chord. But that wouldn't have been quite as good because we were just hearing a lot of that. See, that's too expected. That's why all he has to do is keep this one note and resolve the other 2. That's not even one of the resolutions I played because in this case he's moving 2 notes, not just one. Because who says you're only allowed to move 1 note at a time? I don't think even at the Niedermeyer school they had rules like, especially at the Schola Cantorum, no rules like that. So what you're hearing is an augmented chord with two notes moving and a one common tone, and it moves to a very fresh harmony. And then that's when you get the tune without the pickup. But as soon as that note comes in, things change. Because this is adding a seventh, and then we get, I won't analyze every single chord, but basically he's moving between dominant sevenths, half diminished sevenths, ninth chords, all of these chords that Debussy grabs onto in a similar way, thinking they don't need to be explained by theory. You know, it's Debussy who said, there is no theory, I only care what I hear. Pleasure is the law. Debussy got that in some of those ideas from Fauré's music, but Fauré would not have said that exactly, because Fauré liked to think in the Niedermeyer way, which is that all these things are available. All this strange harmony is available, but it's still actually in a key. It's still functioning in a basic way, because his ear was so expanded by that. Whereas Debussy came from a more traditional place, ironically, heard those harmonies all over the place and pulled them apart and said, I don't see why we can't just use them any way we want. The teacher that Debussy said that to at the Conservatoire was named Guiraud. Guiraud famously said, well, that sounds beautiful, but it can't be used because it has no theory behind it. Guiraud was, right before Fauré, the inspector of local and provincial conservatoires. So Fauré took over from that position. It's true, it's kind of amusing. We only know who Guiraud is today because of his comments to Debussy and his giving him, he said he was a very, very talented student but had a lot of trouble with discipline, harmonic discipline, not behavior. All right, that's a beautiful section. Let's see, there are lots of great moments. Well, listen to this harmonic back and forth. I'm playing it more times than it happens. But here you have a chord based on the note F. It's a dominant ninth. What does that mean? Some of you know, but you have a triad and a seventh. After 7, skip a note 9. Then you would have 11, then 13. And 13th chords happen a lot in Debussy, but they occur in Fauré as well. Before that, 11ths and 9ths were always dissonances that must resolve. Composers used them, but they were dissonances. Here, they're just to luxuriate in. It's completely different. And it makes sense with his life, doesn't it, that these harmonies that are available, he can luxuriate in them and he doesn't have to change key, actually. In other words, he stays married and has, now I have something to tell you about this. If you think this is just my crazy idea, there's a musician who said that the harmonies of this period are excessive coquetry. Who was it? Ravel. So he heard it that way too. And I was thinking about this as a concept before I came across that quote of Ravel, and then I felt completely justified. I felt justified before, but now more. Because I don't think it matters who said what. If Ravel had said something I disagreed with, it would bother me. But I still think the thought is more important than who said it. Don't you think that? Otherwise, the debate's going to be complicated tonight. So, okay. Let's hear this section, starting at, this is right where we stopped, the so-called second theme. That's bar 32. I mean, that wasn't bar 32, but that's where we're going to start. Okay, now, what you just heard at the very end was a normal, old-fashioned, conventional 5/7 to 1 cadence. Right before that, there was a lot of other stuff. Let me say a few words about that. Basically, one of the things that Fauré does, and this becomes part of Debussy's grammar, his syntax, is to take a note that resolves melodically, but harmonize it in an unexpected way, making that note dissonant. So for example, the violin goes, start here. And this you hear, and if you got this, that would be gorgeous but old-fashioned. If you got this, that would be a resolution. But what he does is he leaves it. He leaves the note that should have resolved conventionally, or he leaves it there, and it becomes a ninth of the chord that it should have resolved to. And then again, this could have gone, but he goes, he makes that note dissonant. So this is another one of his techniques, which it sounds, another person who did a little bit of this in a different way was Wagner, but this is very, very different from that. It's just the idea of a dissonance and a kind of constant surprise. So Fauré is writing a melody which could have traditional harmonies, and each time a note resolves, instead of getting the chord you want, that note becomes extremely dissonant at the moment of resolution. It's very bittersweet. It's the kind of thing that in a school classroom, you would have to defend it a lot, especially at that time. You know, we're in the opposite situation now, where almost nothing needs to be defended unless the course has a name, which is, you know, writing in the style of so-and-so or counterpoint from this century. Because if you're writing your own music, who can stop you from doing anything? Nobody, and nor should they. They shouldn't. But it took a long time to get there, and the Conservatoire had one set of ideas. The Schola Cantorum had a much more rigid and difficult set of ideas. The Schola Cantorum also taught philosophy attached to every harmony and scale and counterpoint. There was philosophy that was religious, and everything had meaning, and everything had to do with Christianity. In the Schola, in the Conservatoire, it had more to do with personality and expression and poetry, but it still had to come from some rules. It was Fauré who opened up the Conservatoire and said, we should study what they're studying at the Schola Cantorum also, but not the way they're doing it. We should take that old music, forget the philosophy, let's take the notes so that we're educated in early French music and the early music of the church. Why not? We should know it, but we should also know what's happening right now, and we should put it together. And so he actually was the great conciliator. He got everybody to believe that he was doing the right thing. A real master of that. And not everybody loved him for it, but most of the composers and the students did. Except, of course, Vincent d'Indy, who never liked anything about it. But now, I think before we hear the whole movement, which we should do, because it's substantial, I want to make sure I have not left out a thing that I was going to say to you. I left my entire score over here. Well, does anybody have a comment or a question about anything I've said so far, or a rebuttal? Yes, that's okay if you don't. So I'll summarize it then. If you've been listening really well, you're saying, I heard this already. But on the other hand, that's what summaries are. Fauré, his training at the Niedermeyer School consisted of this rare subculture of harmonic learning that goes back to the Baroque period, in which a key could be full of colors and changes and alterations, and notes from all the other keys could infiltrate, and it wouldn't mean a modulation. It's all just there for color and for expressivity. In fact, and I hadn't said this, the word for changing things sharps and flats and naturals is called chromatic. The word chromatic means color. So they took it literally in a way. When you say chromatic in the classical period, to Beethoven or Mozart, chromatic meant an alteration with a purpose. There was no such thing as a note, a sharp or a flat or a natural, that wasn't there for a harmonic purpose. But the word chromatic, in its absolutely purest sense, simply means to color a note. A C is colored by a sharp, C sharp. So for these people, they took that literally. There was a book in the early 20th century written by Vincent Persichetti, who was my teacher when I was 16. And in his book, which is not used anymore, it starts by saying any note can follow any other note. Any chord can follow any other chord. And he goes on to say anything can happen, but how do we decide? It was an interesting book. It had its problems, though, because since anything can happen, you don't really need to read most of it. But as I discovered, it was a bit problematic. But in this, he did do a very similar thing, though, to Niedermeyer. And I don't know if he knew Niedermeyer. It never came up, and he died in the 80s, so I'll never find out. But he had a modern version of Niedermeyer, which was, he said, what if chords were all built on fourths? As they sometimes are in Copland and Hindemith. What if chords were built on seconds, like they are in Ives? Or Henry Cowell? What if they're just clusters? You know? What if chords were built on sevenths? Something like that, and you can keep it going, as they often are. Why are they only built on thirds? Well, there are acoustical reasons, there's historical reasons. So his book was, What If? The Niedermeyer book was very similarly, they didn't ask what if, but it said every dissonance can be considered a consonance, and it's up to you to figure out how to make a context for this. And that's Fauré, whose life became, with its turmoil, with its struggles, with his increasing deafness, with his unhappiness, the language that he involved expressed perfectly the passion, the drama, and the turmoil of his life. In other words, the vocabulary that he was given made it possible for him to truly express who he was. That's a great thing. And so now let us hear the entire first movement. And I'm just going to go sit in the back. I won't say anything. another political thing that relates to Fauré and perhaps our time. It was the year 1905 that Fauré was appointed president of the conservatory, right after the French